Hi, everyone, and welcome to this episode of Prevention Profiles Take 5. I'm Rich Lucy, Senior Prevention Program Manager in the Drug Enforcement Administration's Community Outreach and Prevention Support section. Excited about today's episode. It's a special episode, and let me tell you a little bit about it first before I introduce today's guest. So National Recovery Month is a national observance held every September to promote and support new evidence-based treatment and recovery practices, the nation's strong and proud recovery community, and the dedication of service providers and communities who make recovery in all its forms possible. In recognition of National Recovery Month, we're focusing this episode on issues related to supporting college students in recovery or who may be experiencing problems due to their alcohol or other drug misuse. And because of that, our special guest is Kristina Canfield, the Executive Director of the Association of Recovery in Higher Education. So let me tell you a little bit about Kristina. She attended Ohio University, where she earned both her bachelor's degree in history and a master's degree in college student personnel. During her time at Ohio University, Kristina helped to establish the collegiate recovery community in order to assist students in or seeking recovery from substance use disorders on that campus. Kristina is very passionate about the field of collegiate recovery, and her vision is that one day, every institution of higher education offers support for students in or seeking recovery so that they feel supported no matter their chosen path of recovery. And with that, Kristina, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much. Happy Recovery Month. Excited to be here.
Absolutely. It's no secret. I mean, I've been in this field for 30 plus years. And when I started my career in state government in New York, where I'm from, I remember even then in collaborating with and providing services and resources for colleges and universities, we even then were concerned about what we called at that time aftercare. It was the aftercare for students who were returning to campus after, time in recovery. And, in New York, we had a couple, three colleges and universities. LaSalle comes to mind as being a college that had a strong, support program for these students. Here we are 3 decades plus later, and boy, it has really grown. And that really is, my first question for you, that, over the past few years, and I'll even say decades, the recovery movement has really taken hold on college campuses. Why do you think that is?
Yeah, I really the last decade has seen the most explosive growth with collegiate recovery communities or programs on college campuses. The growth of the more organized movement really is in much thanks to some benefactors out there who invested, monetarily in ensuring that universities had the ability to fund these programs. And so back in 2012, especially, the Stacey Mathewson Foundation, Transforming Youth Recovery, provided hundreds of seed grants across the United States to help start collegiate recovery programs. And we still see the fruits of that today. I mean, many of those programs are still in existence. But outside of that, I'm a person in long-term recovery, and even though I hit an important birthday milestone this year, turning 40, I did find recovery at 21 years old as a junior in college. And, 18 some years ago, that was more rare. It was more rare to find people my age in the recovery community. They were there, certainly, but there weren't as many. And so I think, too, what we've seen over the last decade is this growing trend of, folks finding recovery younger and younger. That's one part. But then also people wanting to continue their education, go back to school. And that doesn't just mean traditional age students. I was a
Right.
traditional age student. But even, folks who find recovery in their 40s and 50s and 60s, wanting to go back to school and change their lives. And so I think we've just seen this growing trend. And I'm sure we'll talk some about stigma later as well. But I think as some of the tide has turned on stigma, it's becoming more of an acceptable service on campus as well.
And I'm glad you mentioned that, because I think recovery has really blossomed over, as you say, the last decade among the general public as well. And then perhaps that's why it's translated to college campuses. I mean, I think not going to tie it directly to Michael Botticelli, who I know. So I've known Michael for a long time through my mentor, Fran Harding. But Michael was the first person in long-term recovery to hold the position of director of ONDCP, and I think he used that pulpit to really raise awareness, and that's where I think if I were to kind of draw any kind of a line to it, I think that would be it.
Yeah, I mean, I have a very distinct memory of the first time I met Michael way back in 2010 as a graduate student at Ohio University, trying to start a collegiate recovery community at that time. Getting the opportunity to meet Michael Botticelli, and I just remember being like floored, like, oh my gosh, here's this, for me, it was like this really like major important person in federal government admitting they're in recovery, talking about the importance of collegiate recovery programs. I have this very clear memory of that. It was just, we'll call it a core memory, I guess. But,
Yeah.
but I think you're right. I don't think that we can, speak too little of some of the folks, especially around that time, 2010 to 2012, who were really starting to speak very openly. And that really coincides with the time that the Anonymous People was released as well, which I think just had a major impact on our society, as that documentary was released and more people saw it.
Yeah. I have of course, my next formal question to ask you, but I'm going to ask you one that I didn't prep you on, and it's not a curveball because I know you'll be able to answer this. But for as long as I've been in the field, and I know you've worked on this issue, and we talk about the recovery movement on college campuses, in the prevention world, we always talk about the risk and protective factors, right? And that's always been one of the primary concerns for students who have, gone into some form of recovery, treatment, I should say, treatment off campus, and then to, maintain and sustain their recovery coming back to campus. They're coming into an environment that may not be all that healthy in terms of the risk factors and such. So what do you see on that in terms of, how schools actually have to, help the student in that regard? What do they have to help navigate?
Yeah, and it's such an important point, because there are certainly, risk and protective factors for recovery as well. And I have to, the whole time you were asking that question, I was thinking about just being a young person in recovery, 21 years old, within that first year,
I
returning
took you
to
back, didn't I?
I know, I was going way back. I was like, oh gosh, here we go. But I love talking about it because it's really where like my passion comes from too, was, as a young person, new in recovery, attempting to return to my original undergraduate institution. And there were so many barriers in place. And some of those were, dealing with some of the consequences of my past and having to go through, various processes to just go back to school. um
Mm-hmm.
but then also not having a support system, showing up to campus every day with massive high anxiety, that I was going to run into, to old, using buddies or things like that. People would ask me really hard questions like, what happened to you? And I didn't even know how
Mm-hmm.
to answer that, because, and, we're also talking about, 17, 18 years ago, where I was really coached. You don't talk about it. You don't tell anybody what happened to you. Don't tell anybody that you were in treatment, or that you had a problem with substances. Like, you don't tell anyone that. And so that people would ask me really hard questions like, what happened to me? And I didn't know how to answer. And so I had no support system. And I think that is, some of the things that I see happening, I've watched happen over the last decade, I've been a proponent for, is really, it's not just about having only a collegiate recovery program on campus. Like, that's a start, but there
Mm-hmm.
has to be a cultural shift on campus as well. And I know that is a major ask. That's a massive thing to do, but we've seen that happen. And a lot of that is through programming. Recovery ally trainings are really, really popular on many college campuses, even ones that don't have collegiate recovery programs. So this idea that we're training our staff and our faculty and even peers about what it means to be a recovery ally. What does it mean to create a recovery friendly environment? I think educating faculty, especially on the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act, and how recovery and substance use disorder plays into that, and accommodations has also played a part in that as well. And so I think we're starting to see some of that shift, but also I think we're at an interesting point in history, where I don't know that you can meet a person in this day and time that whose life has not been touched, affected, altered in some way by someone's substance use disorder, the loss of someone to an overdose. It is extremely rare, especially on a college campus, to meet someone who's like, oh yeah, I've never known anybody, who ever had an issue with drugs or alcohol. One of the stories I tell people is that there's a local high school here in Birmingham, Alabama, where I live. And every spring I give a talk to their graduating seniors, and it's a smaller high school. So there might be 75, young people in the room. And every year I ask folks to raise their hand if their life has in any way been affected, by addiction, by recovery, by, loss of someone to an overdose. And for the last 3 years, every single student in that room has raised their hand. Every single one. And
Mm-hmm.
they're going to college. Almost every single one of these students are going to college. And so I think we're seeing a shift in sort of the experience of the population too. And so this openness of it gives way to the ability to shift culture on campus as well.
Yeah. Well, for my second question, it really is anchored around more recent history. And we know that alcohol and drug use can tend to increase during stressful times, following a traumatic event. And 2020 certainly saw its share of stressful times. I somewhat kiddingly say there's not an asterisk big enough that we can put next to 2020. But, we know, we do tend to focus in on COVID and the pandemic as it relates to 2020, but I continue to remind people that 2020 also was a time of civil unrest related to racial injustice. 2020 was a time where we saw perhaps the most contentious presidential election in our history. And so what have been some of the challenges, and I know you mentioned, the term support system a little while ago, but what have been some of the challenges around supporting students in recovery during the past 2.5 years?
Oh gosh, getting goosebumps just thinking about 2020. And I think about how my 7-year-old daughter will one day hopefully study history,
Right.
and she was homeschooled as she entered pre-K during that time. So, I was juggling multiple things as everyone was. But, I love that you pointed out, you know, COVID, the pandemic, civil unrest, racial injustice, a very contentious presidential election. I'm going to throw in there really a mental health and substance use pandemic kind of happening there too.
Right.
And the reason I say that is there was a believe it or not, there was an online Zoom meditation meeting that I attended
Mhm.
regularly every Friday throughout most of 2020. And they always had a guest speaker before we would go into this meditation session. And one of the guest speakers is an author who wrote about the inner work of racial justice. And so essentially that self-care, the inner work we need to do when we are in the social justice field. And she used this term that I loved, and that was interlocking pandemics.
Mm.
That we were dealing with interlocking pandemics, and no one was immune to that. So COVID, civil unrest, racial injustice, political unrest, and then let's never forget the mental health piece of that. And when I say mental health, I'm including, substance use as well.
Mhm.
I'm very open about the fact that in 2020, with 15 years of long-term, very active recovery, I chose to enter the hospital myself to treat my own mental health.
Mm.
And now I say it so openly. I talk about it really openly because I think it's important. I think it's important when we talk about risk and protective factors of recovery and a support system. The biggest issue we saw in 2020, and even in the even I think we're still struggling with it in some respects,
Yeah, absolutely.
is isolation.
Yes.
Um, we talk about isolation being dangerous for folks in recovery, especially early in recovery. And even as a person with 15 years of sustained recovery, feeling very isolated, from my support system, from my family, from everything that sort of gave me purpose and drive, and then really, and now watching these other interlocking pandemics unfold as well. And the weight of that was intense. It was very intense. And I know I'm not the only person who felt that way. And at the time, I was actually working on campus at the University of Alabama, Birmingham, managing their collegiate recovery program. And when I chose to admit myself into the mental health hospital, I called my boss, who's the director of counseling services, and let her know what was happening, obviously, because I was still managing the program. And the thing she asked me, she said, "What do you want me to tell the students?" And
Mm.
I said, "The truth." And she said, "Really?" And I said, "Yeah, I want you to tell them the truth. Tell them exactly where I am. Tell them exactly what I'm going through. You don't have to give, wild details, but they need to know that it's okay to not be okay, but it's even more important to say I'm not okay, and
Mhm.
to reach out for help, because I think that was one thing I personally struggled with, right? Was like, oh my gosh, I have 15 years of recovery. Like, what's wrong with me that I'm struggling this bad? And, but that wasn't a struggle, that was strength. And
Mm.
so, being able to demonstrate that to my student group at that time, I think was really important to me. And when I got out of the hospital, we all met for their weekly recovery meeting, and we talked really openly about the importance of, what are you doing to connect? So that really became the focus of collegiate recovery. And at the time, even though I was a contracted employee at the time for ARHE, one of the things our former executive director really focused on was building these online virtual spaces, right, where folks could connect more with each other. And that is the struggle you saw with collegiate recovery programs as well, is how do we shift these very like in-person, on campus connected programs, how do you shift them online pretty much overnight and
Mm.
somehow mimic that same connection? But the online resources that most collegiate recovery programs provided, they were the lifeline
Mm.
for folks, and we just got really creative. I remember as a staff member, I would host a trivia night like once a week online, and I invited students from wherever. I didn't care if they were my students or not, just like, come on over and let's have trivia night. And so many collegiate recovery programs got really creative with engaging their students and making sure they felt cared for and like they belonged. I don't want to undermine too the struggle, especially in the collegiate recovery profession. We saw programs that were once vibrant really struggle to continue,
Right.
because higher ed as a whole was very much affected by COVID, especially
Mm-hmm.
enrollment and budgets. We saw programs whose budgets were cut. And so we're still recovering from that.
Of course.
As a profession, we're still recovering from that. But I think we've also come a long way.
Yeah. Two things you mentioned. One, so just like with everything else, the virtual options really were a lifeline for people, to have that kind of a space for people to still meet. But the other thing was you mentioned, and we knew this, I think it was most in 2021 as we were all starting to come back to campus and such, but it was this notion of self-care that, we we can't help take care of others if we don't take care of ourselves, kind of first and foremost. And in some respects, you have to be a bit selfish, in that regard and say, you know what, give me the space and grace to take care of myself so that I can take care of others. So, in one respect, it sounds like, from your story, that's a bit of what you had to do.
Yeah, I can't pour from a cup that doesn't even exist. It's like not even that
Right,
it's empty.
right.
It's like it doesn't even exist anymore. And so I had to rebuild, my own, self-care structure, and I've been in a helping profession for as long as I can remember. Whether it's been in higher ed, student services. I've, also worked in treatment facilities in my past as well, both inpatient and outpatient. So I've always kind of been in a helping profession. And so, that notion of, boundaries are important, self-care is important, and the helpers need help too. Is just so critical. And I don't know that at any point in my life or career did that become more evident than in 2020, when it felt like the world kind of stopped and it was like, oh, what do we
Yeah.
do? What do we do now?
Right.
So
So you mentioned earlier stigma, and my third question is really, kind of centered around that issue. And although substance use disorders are chronic and treatable medical conditions, we have been saying that for a long time. It's on par with cancer and high blood pressure, hypertension, heart disease, right? Studies show that people with substance use disorders still face discrimination and stigma that can affect their health and well-being in numerous ways. And research also shows that the language that we use contributes to stigma and discrimination against people with substance use disorders, including by healthcare professionals, which might be a surprise to some people. Again, I've been in this field for quite a while, as have you, and the concept of stigma has been around for quite a while. And I know for me, it feels like, when are we going to reach that point, right? So has any progress been made in reducing stigma, and what challenges do remain?
yeah, absolutely. I think there's been a ton of progress, and I think in my hardest moments, where I'm like, oh my gosh, how are we still having this conversation? I have to remind myself of how far we've
Exactly.
come.
Yeah.
So I have those moments where I'm like, wait, did that really just happen? Like I said earlier, 18 plus years ago, entering into recovery as a young person, really being coached that we don't talk about it. You don't tell anyone that you're in recovery. Like it was really this like cloak of shame almost, and even back then I thought, this is so weird because I'm so happy to be alive. Like,
Hmm.
why aren't we telling everyone like recovery is a possibility? Why aren't we telling everyone that these resources exist and these communities exist, and like how cool life can be without substances? And I mean, those were concepts way beyond my thinking at that point in my life. There was a point, entering into recovery at 21 years old, I genuinely thought my life was over.
Hmm.
I was never going to have fun again. I was never gonna go to another concert, and anybody who knows me like knows I'm a big jam band fan. And so I thought, like, man, I'm never gonna see Fish again, and so, but I come to find out it was the exact opposite. Not only was I gonna go on to be able to do all the things I love, but I was gonna have more fun, and I was gonna make more connections, and I was gonna make deeper connections with people. And so I think we've come so far in the sense that we are more open about talking about recovery. I think it's, you mentioned Michael Botticelli earlier. I think there's been some just really great folks, especially very visible folks,
Hmm.
who
Hmm.
have been willing to be very vocal about their recovery. And Patrick Kennedy comes to mind as well. Um,
Absolutely. Yeah.
and then too, I think there's a lot of actors and artists and just famous people, just very, very visible people who have been more willing to be open about their journey in recovery. And so I think some of that has helped. I always, always, always point to the 2016 Surgeon General's report, Facing Addiction in America. I think I can't talk about stigma and the strides we've made without mentioning that just groundbreaking report. And I jokingly say to folks, it's some of the best 500 pages of reading I think you could do if you're a nerd like me. But it was massive. This actual statement, like from the Surgeon General's office, that addiction is not a moral failing, but a public health crisis.
Right.
And so I think we start seeing the tide changed right around then. I think the succession of things happened. The release of the documentary, The Anonymous People, I think was major. The Facing Addiction in America, Surgeon General's report. And then we start seeing these other pieces happen. And so I do think we've come so far, in the 18 years I've been in recovery, especially in the last decade. Is there work still to be done? Yes. Excuse me, sorry. So one of the things I still do, I still do a lot of advocacy in the collegiate recovery space. So I have a lot of conversations with, university administrators and decision makers, and educating about collegiate recovery. And I still get blown away. I have this moment where I'm like, wait, what? Where whenever I hear someone say like, oh, we don't have those students here,
Hmm.
Or why would we want those students here? Like, why would we develop a whole program that attracts people who had a drug problem? And I'm like, so it still catches me off guard. Like, even though I've been in this profession for 13 years, it's like, okay, we're having this conversation, we're doing it. And so there's still a lot of work to be done. And so much of that really is just through education. It's one of the reasons I am completely okay being very vocal and open about my own personal recovery, because you know what? I was that student. And once I got into recovery, I was a very active student and a very successful student, who then became a successful alumna, who contributes to her university. I'm a very proud Bobcat, from Ohio University. And, and so much of that is because of the support I found there in the administration when we were vying for the development of that program. But it's still there. It still exists. I think one thing I also have to remember when I'm dealing with stigma is I don't always know someone's story. The person I'm talking to, they could have grown up in an abusive household that was, because of someone's substance use disorder. People have their own personal traumas. And so I really have to approach those conversations from a place of empathy and love and care and education, and say, we're going to work through this, because I just don't know people's personal stories,
Right.
or where they're coming from.
Yeah. Wow, there's so much to unpack there. It's funny that you say, boy, there is definitely truth in the statement, ignorance is bliss, right? I mean, that's the whole idea of, well, that doesn't exist on this campus or in this community, or, and it's not just to college campuses. We know that that's true in other settings as well. I'm so glad that you mentioned the Surgeon General's report, as someone who is intimately involved in the development of that report from my previous time at SAMHSA. I always point people back to that landmark report because it still holds relevance today. So to our viewers, first of all, chapter 3, the prevention chapter, read it, know it, it's such a great foundation for the work we do. But now, if I remember correctly from all the different chapters, I believe it's chapter 5 is the chapter that focuses on recovery. And we had Dr. Keith Humphreys, who oversaw the development of that chapter. And again, I think it raised the profile, for Dr. Murthy at the time, and even now again, in his second stint as Surgeon General. It just elevated the whole, gave recovery visibility. I think even just being in the report itself was getting visibility. As we said, it's a landmark report. But then when you dive into its contents and you see that the recovery gets its own chapter, it gets its own focus. And I think, I'm so glad that you brought it up, because I would hope that our viewers would go back to that. And it's linked on our website, campusdrugprevention.gov. There, do your favorite search engine search for, Surgeon General's report, alcohol, drugs, health, you'll find it. But I'm glad you brought it up, because people really should become familiar with the contents of that report.
I refer to that report as like the greatest thing that came out of 2016, which was also a really high profile year for people we lost to drug overdoses. It
Mhm.
was a very high profile year for that, and
Mhm.
so it was kind
Mhm.
of capstoned by this report. Um, that was, yeah, recovery having its own chapter was massive. I mean, for me in my profession, like seeing collegiate recovery, being mentioned in that, recovery high schools being mentioned in that, and some of the research behind that, and supporting their existence and development. I mean, that was major.
Mhm.
And I would be remiss if I also didn't mention um the last three sitting presidents, and so we're talking about both sides of the aisle here. The last
Mhm.
three
Mhm.
sitting presidents have all contributed to the growth and the visibility of collegiate recovery as well.
Mhm.
Both President Obama and President Trump sent letters, through the Department of Education to university administrators, talking about collegiate recovery and the importance of investing in those programs. Of course, President Biden's drug strategy with the ONDCP.
Yeah.
Yeah,
He's
I
a
mentioned,
longtime supporter of
yes,
this issue
yes.
just in general.
Right, absolutely. And but for the first time, so it's been in the national drug strategy for the last several times, but this time really having metrics attached to it, that we want to see
Right.
the growth of collegiate recovery programs in recovery high schools by this percentage in this many years. So that was the first time we saw metrics attached to it. And so truly, again, I have to go back to just this last, 10, 13 years. We've seen these pieces of progress happening, and they're building on each other. And that's huge. And
Yeah.
I have to, I really want to reiterate too, when I talk about, US politics and both sides of the aisle, this is a bipartisan issue. I mean,
Absolutely.
truly it's a nonpartisan issue. It doesn't matter what your political leanings are. This affects everyone. It is a public health crisis, like as mentioned in the Surgeon General's report. Um, and I really do credit that report with starting to shift some of the stigma. And one of the other chapters in that report that I loved was addressed to the medical professionals.
Mhm.
Um, and I think so. You mentioned that earlier, by the way, and I have to say, for our listeners too, is honestly some of the worst stigma I've ever personally faced in my life has been in medical spaces.
Mhm. Mhm.
Even as a person in long-term recovery, I also have an immunodeficiency disorder. I have, a chronic illness. And so I'm under care, all the time. I have to take immunobiologics. And
Yeah.
so my medical care is a major part of my health and well-being. And whew, I have faced some real stigma in those spaces in the past. And me as a human being, like I'm just a fierce advocate, so I have no problem advocating for myself, but not everybody feels comfortable doing that. That could turn
Right.
people away from life-saving care.
Right.
Just one bad instance in an emergency room setting could completely turn somebody away from seeking life-saving medical care. There's
Mhm.
still a lot of work to do in that space.
Yeah.
So much work to do in that space.
Yeah. Yeah. Personally, with challenges, I kind of pride myself as being a word guy. I'm very careful about the words we use. I've done presentations on the importance of terminology. And, for me, I see the challenge still exists when, if, and I don't correct people publicly, I would never do that. But if we're in a closed meeting or in a, you know, different type of a setting, and I talk about, instead of saying this, we should be saying this. And I get kind of either the overt or the not so overt eye roll. It's sort of like really, I mean, it's just a word. And see, that's the point, and I think that is inherent. You know, I kind of always go back to the adage of sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me. You know what? They do. And it's a coping mechanism, right? It's what we did as little kids, and we even kind of probably in the back of our minds have as adults. But, I think that for me is the challenge when I see that, again, either the real or not so real eye roll about it's just a word. Yeah, that's the point. So I think that's one, will we ever get there? Probably not, in terms of that. But I think that you have made that point very clearly. We have made significant strides, and we should be proud of that. Hold on to that as we continue to move forward on this particular issue. So my fourth question actually has to do with the structure or the actual, collegiate recovery programs. As we've talked, you've alluded to them, referenced them, throughout this interview. So for our viewers, and specifically the practitioners who are either on a campus or maybe in the community working with campuses, and they want to start a collegiate recovery community or a formal collegiate recovery program on campus, what are the things that should be the top of mind for them as they set out to do this?
Yeah, understand your student population, I think is for, and if you're students who are starting a collegiate recovery program, gather all your friends. There's a lot of power in the student voice. That's something I love reminding students. You will always have more power on the college campus than you ever probably believe that you do. I think I had more luck as a student advocating to my administration than I ever did as a staff person, though I did well as a staff person too. So I think
Student voices are much louder for some
yes,
reason, than the professionals on campus.
they're very passionate. Like
Mm-hmm.
leverage that,
Yeah.
I think for me, I'm going to start basic with data. And so one of the questions at ARHE, we do have a readiness assessment that we'll do with universities to help them look at just the different aspects of is your institution ready to start building a collegiate recovery program? What could that look like? Who needs to be involved? But one of the questions on that survey is, have you looked at your data? Have you pulled your National College Health Assessment data? Or core survey data, because both of those data collection instruments, which are widely used in higher education, do ask questions about recovery. So while they're collecting information around rate of substance use, types of substances used, mental health, food security, they're asking all kinds of questions. There are questions in there specifically about recovery, which is actually pretty cool. And so pulling that data specific to your campus can help give you an idea of just numbers and need. And then, I think one of the hardest parts is finding students sometimes, because they still will live pretty anonymously because of stigma very often. But once you can find them, it's really about assessing their needs. One of the things I think is really important is being able to assess the environment. And so what is offered in the community in regard to recovery protective services, right? What's offered in the surrounding community, and what are the gaps that the university could fill? For example, when I was working at the university here in Birmingham, you name a 12-step support group, like it exists in Birmingham, Alabama, like ones I had never even heard of until I moved here. And so the need for very specific recovery support groups was not a major need of the students on my campus at that time, because they really had that need filled in the community. What they needed was a space as young people to gather sort of across those groups. And so through that understanding of what was offered in my environment and what wasn't offered, we were able to start an all recovery meeting, really open, to any student at the university, and they could bring their friends if they wanted to, and just to, intermingle and support each other in their recovery. One of the simplest things you can do in the beginning is, do something fun. I loved doing like pizza, like the last Tuesday of every month, everybody would come. One of my favorite activities we ever did was laser tag versus another university, just about 45 minutes down the highway here. We were the reigning champions. I like to remind them of that all the time. Don't care how many bowl games they've won, we won laser tag. So, but starting there is like, what's your data? Can you find the students? And you don't need to find a ton. If you could find one or two really champions for this cause on your campus, they will bring their friends who will bring their friends, because you are creating a space where they can truly be themselves. And I mentioned recovery ally trainings earlier. I think that is critical early on. Because if we're going to be building a program that is a safe space for this piece of a student's identity, we need to make sure we're creating an environment beyond that space too. And so, ensuring we're training faculty and staff and peers around campus to be strong allies, and what it means to be in recovery, to teach them things like language. What does that mean? Just a word, and I get it. It's like, so not just a word, because typically when we use those words, they come from a place of hatred. There's some deep rooted, hatred in there attached to a lot of those, words. And it still sometimes would just strike me like, oh gosh, like, oh,
Yeah.
we do. ARHE, of course, has lots of resources to help. Folks can always reach out to me on our website. We have a really beautiful getting started guide, and it really breaks everything down of, who to bring to the table, how to bring together like a planning committee to get things going. What are the things you should be focusing on? What does an assessment of your environment look like? What should you be looking for? And pieces like that. And so I think, those are some of the first steps to really take.
Yeah. So I almost thought a podcast episode would get by without me mentioning the strategic prevention framework, but it's not going to, because it sounds like, it's almost like there'd be a strategic recovery framework. It's have a strategic plan. I can't stress that enough when I'm talking to people about, prevention. And I just heard you say, without calling it that, do the assessment. That is step number one of the SPIF. It's same thing here. You're looking at assessment and building capacity. What are the gaps? What do we need to fill? It sounds like it right there.
Yeah, and I'm also a trained preventionist, because as many collegiate recovery professionals, we wore many hats on campuses, and we still do. And so strategic prevention framework was something I worked with very closely, throughout my career, and often referred to that, as we were, working toward building, collegiate recovery programs on various campuses that I've worked for as well. Gathering that data, assessing, having a committee together to strategically plan step by step what this is going to look like. That's where I've seen a lot of success over the years.
Yeah. So as we wind up, I always leave the last question. It's the same for all the guests. It's your time, as has been this whole interview, but this is the time for you to really look in the eyes, if you will, figuratively, of our viewers. So what do you want to say to encourage the professionals who are working to, not only prevent drug use among college students, but support those students who are in recovery, as well as the students themselves, because we know that they also watch the podcast? What do you want to say to encourage them?
I know you're tired. I do. I so emphasize.
I hear a but coming. I hear a but coming.
Not a but, it's an and. I know
Okay.
you're tired, and I hope you never lose sight of why you do this work. I'm gonna get a little emotional here. Sorry, Rich, but
No, don't ever apologize.
On my hardest days, right? On my hardest days, the days where I'm sitting here and I'm like, oh my gosh, there's too many emails, there's too much being asked of me, I'm being pulled in a million directions. On my hardest days, when I fought my hardest battles in my profession, I always go back to that student who's out there somewhere, who doesn't even know this exists, and how their life is going to be changed when they come into contact, with this type of support service on their campus. That student who isn't even in college yet, who is eventually going to step foot on a college campus. And that goes for prevention too. To me, what is so critical is the full continuum of care, that we continue to invest energy, time, research, everything into that full continuum, the whole spectrum for students, because as we strengthen each part of that continuum, we strengthen the health and well-being of our students. And I know you're tired, and I know so much is asked of you. And in higher education specifically, every higher education professional wears multiple hats. They are not nearly paid enough. I know that for a fact. My joke was I always worked, my title always included like 3 jobs, but it never was I paid 3 salaries.
Right.
However, um, please don't lose sight of your why, and why this is important to you, and just please don't lose sight of that. That's what I have to remind myself of every day. I sit down and I think about and I picture them in my mind, like the students I've worked with over the years, and where they are now. And there's one student in particular I always go back to, and all I did was walk into her freshman class one day to give a 15-minute talk about what the collegiate recovery program was, who I was, and left. And a couple of days later, the student showed up in my office, and looked at me across the desk with tears and said, I didn't know where else to go, but I felt like I could come here.
Mm.
And pulled up her sleeves and showed me the track marks on her arms, and she said, I'm so scared, I'm gonna die.
Hmm.
And I got up and I just looked at her and I said, first, can I please give you a hug?
Hmm. Yep.
And I did.
Yep.
And she said yes, and I gave her a hug. And then I thanked her for her bravery, her courage to walk into essentially a stranger's office, and say help, and we were able to, get that student into treatment and eventually get her back into school when she was ready. And I've followed her life since then, even though I've been gone from that university for a long time, and watched her success. And on my hardest days, I think about that. That's
Hmm.
why. That's why.
Yeah. Yeah.
Don't lose sight of that.
That is just great advice to end on. You certainly in the prevention field, we know we have to have a bit of a trust and a faith. We are trying to prevent or stop things from ever happening that we will never see. And that's hard to measure. That's always been a challenge in our field. Um, but we have to just hold, fast to that. What we're doing is helping, people out there. And I have to hold on to that. And I'll tie it back to the self-care. You know, it, yes, we are all tired and there are days that are hard, but you really do have to take care of yourself in order to help others. And when you do take care of yourself, you'll find a way to dig deeper, and get more out of that cup that seems empty, as we've said. I really do think it ties back to that. But, I appreciate that advice that you've given to our viewers.
Yeah, prevention, recovery, intervention, treatment, all of it. We don't make progress without that, investment in every single area. Some of the most fun I've ever had on a college campus was in prevention spaces.
Yeah.
Um and so yeah, please don't lose sight of that.
Yeah. Kristina, thank you so much for being on this episode of the podcast. You've given us, first of all, I want to say thank you for your openness, your vulnerability, your candor, um, and all the great takeaways that I know that viewers are going to get in watching this episode. So thank you again
Thank you for having me.
so much. And to our viewers, I always have to thank you for tuning in to this episode and all of the previous episodes and the future ones to come. We hope, that you get something out of each of these episodes. That's our intent. And I've heard from folks who have watched them, so I know it's striking a chord in a good way. So we're just going to keep on doing it. So to our viewers, thanks again for watching. With that, I'm going to wish you a great day.